which will be a peg, a link for us to connect to the contents of daf base, was a house, that's the bias, in which we see a poor man eating his dinner, bread and salt, and on his shoulder stands a Kohen reciting Kriya Shema. It's a little silly, and the sillier it is, the better, like I said, because it makes it sort of memorable. And of course, that's to reference the fact we have Kriya Shema, nighttime, a question of is Ani, the poor man, and the Kohen at the same time or not? Those issues. So hopefully that will work you in good stead. We'll see how it goes. You'll see how it goes. I hope it works for me. I hope it will work for you. I, in the email, asked if someone is a bit of an artist and wants to make a simple illustration for us. Simple illustration, even just with pen and paper, for these pictures, which I would like to send one to a little booklet. I think it will be useful for people. Anybody by chance interested in taking on that exciting role? No. Okay, say it. That's that. So then we started reading the Ramchal's essay on Aggados. So just to review what he said briefly, he said that he's very misudar, he's very organized the way he set things up. So he said, snap it out in case some of the language was lost on us. He said Aggadot, which we said were the non-halachic portions of the Talmud. We divided into two categories. This is the command. He said some are limudim, which I translated as like something like standalone educational, I don't know what I said, statements. And he said some were bi'urim. Bi'urim were explanatory comments that are explaining a particular verse. Explanatory statements. Not standalone, they address, or they explain a particular verse. Aggados, as far as he's concerned, is addressing not just the Aggadah of the Gemorah, but what we would also call midrashim, which are going on psukim, like midrash rabbah type stuff. So, although the Shas doesn't do too much explanation of psukim, it does, but much less. Obviously, if you learn a midrash rabbah, sometimes you just have stories of kings and whatever, and sometimes you have direct attempts to illustrate the meaning or explanation of or deeper intention of a verse. So he said there are two categories. He said the limudim, the standalone education statements, can be divided into two categories. Those that are address ethics, ethical statements. Ethics. Ethics, and those that are he actually said chochma musarim, ethical wisdom, and chochma elokis, as he called it, which we'll call spiritual wisdom, and probably what you're used to. When you hear the word Kabbalah, what you're thinking of, probably something like that. So he said these are the two categories. This category can divide it into two subcategories. He says I'm not addressing the rationale behind Chazal's ethical statements. They're not halachic, but their purpose is obvious and they're not dangerous. A person cannot be stubborn and misunderstand them and cause himself mischief. As opposed to these kinds of statements, which he does want to address, where he says, he goes on to explain that Chazal wanted them not to be forgotten, the deeper wisdom of the Torah. They had the same problem as with the Mishnah, that they could be forgotten because times were tough and people's minds were getting weak. But he says the solution they used of writing down a Mishnah and sort of putting some sort of skeleton for Torah Sheba'al Peh couldn't work for this type of chokmah. Because he said two reasons. First of all, because it's dangerous. It's people can, if you misunderstand, you can really have bad hashkafas and lead to have very bad ideas about to whom you're praying and how the field works and who Hashem is and how things should go. So it's actually dangerous. And second of all, even aside from the danger angle, it's just not befitting of Hashem's deepest secrets to reveal them to lowlives, and therefore we want the lowlives not to have access to it. People with midos ros, this is expression bad midos. So he said, therefore, that this wisdom they encoded, they hid away with a similar. They did a pshara. His lashon was they were botseya, they were compromised. On the one hand, they wrote something down, so it shouldn't be forgotten. But on the other hand, they didn't write it down in any sort of explicit way, like the Mishnah was written down or the Gemorah was written down, so that it should remain sort of a real secret. Instead, they wrote it in a hidden way. And he said they've hidden it in two ways. We'll see there's a third way today, but he listed two ways so far. One way he listed that they were hidden. The first way he said is they were hidden in metaphorical language. Right? Metaphorical language. I think this was right. And that was, he said, either in hashala, metaphors, or also mashalim, like parables. So stories which are really also metaphorical language. I would translate as one thing. So they talk about one thing, but they really mean something else. The second way he said so far was that they said absolute statements. This we were quite rushed at the end of yesterday. They made general, seeming blanket statements that were klali, general, and were mukhlat, absolutes, without any qualifications. And they didn't say this only applies to a particular case or referring to a specific type of scenario. They said in general. And then he finished off by saying this was like the last moment of yesterday. He said they actually did this oftentimes in the Mishnah as well, where they have Mishnahs say absolute statements, which then seem to contradict other Mishnahs or other Brachos. And the Gemorah says, the limited applicability of the statement is in such and such a case. And that's true also by the statements of Chazal. They'll say general statements when they have only very limited applicability, and what they're more interested in is just the limited particular case or time or place. But they didn't bother qualifying it to make the thing, inscrutable to someone who's not an initiative. So we had metaphorical language, and then we had unqualified general statements. Yeah, we had statements that really have specific parameters. That sounds very fancy. Specific gevulot, we call them very specific parameters where they apply. Parameters or applicability. Those are fancy words, I know, but it's neat enough that I can. Okay. I want the board to illustrate this a little further, but let me just finish this schematic for you. He's going to say there's a third way to hit it, which we'll see inside in a moment. And the third way he's going to say is through trivial statements. I'll summarize. He will describe, like Aesop's fables, Grimm's tales. It's not like the Chazal wants something very simple and irrelevant, trivial, but really these trivialities are referring to something very, very significant. So I'll call them seemingly trivial, almost or even ridiculous, perhaps, statements. Yesterday I mentioned there's this book by Aaron Feldman called The Juggler and the King, and I took the translation in English of this essay from it. So there you can see a good example. There are all these stories of this Ramchal, whatever, certain stories in the Gemorah, where you have these they sound like crazy fairy tale type stories, with the Gra goes on to say these are the most deepest secrets, and explains how they're all metaphorical language. And so he's referring to Gemorahs like that, where it seems that they're talking about very trivial things, jugglers standing on fences, shoveling wine. I think who knows what this is all about. So again, he's saying these are actually referring to something very specific, just it seems very, very silly. So he'll have those three categories in my English metaphorical language, three ways to conceal these secrets. They wrote them down, but they wrote it either metaphorically, or as general statements without qualification, where really they need to be qualified, or a sentence they make sense, but they seem to be talking about things that who really cares about, which then have to be uncoded to understand what they're really referring to. Okay? So that's the setup. That's what the essay is going to say. There's another point when we bring out the essay, but we'll do it separately. This is a structure. This is what we said yesterday so far. I just want to. I I'm concerned that it wasn't. I gave some funny. I'm going to erase this already. Is that okay? Can I erase it? I'll take photographs of it. You can take a photograph and circulate it. I got it. I'll circulate it. I'll leave it for The question is, the recording still going. Fantastic. Yeah, we're still minutes. Okay, good. So I'm going to erase this already.
So basically we're saying that these are really non-halachic statements.
Correct. Aggadah are the non-halachic statements. You'll see the line gets a little blurry, but anyways, they're non-halachic in nature. They're ethical in nature, or they're hashkafic in nature. Let's call them. They're speaking about how the world works, or some aspect of the world, as opposed to what you have to or not do. And these were hidden away in one of these three kind of ways as their own problem. I'm going to erase it. I'll send an email around with this. So yesterday, I want, since this is such an essential idea, I want this develop a little further, or just revisit a little more. I gave some examples yesterday of symbols. These are visual symbols, not linguistic symbols, but symbols where if you're an initiate and you have the keys as he described them, so when you look at something like, if you see this, you know what this is referring to. But if you don't, you just look at it as lines. You don't see music. Or I gave you this example, right? If you know what this means, you see that is referring to water. But if you don't know, it just has no connection. This is nothing with music whatsoever. There's nothing musical about this. It's just some abstraction. And this is nothing with water whatsoever, just an abstraction. And if you want to explain to someone, if anyone here does know how this refers to water, that would be convenient. Because that person is thinking, what are you talking about? I don't see water here. And to actually explain how this references water is quite a complicated story. You understand? Even though it's immediate and obvious, those who are on the inside understand it's referring to two atoms of hydrogen and an atom of oxygen that combine to make a molecule. If you're not with it, it doesn't sound at all. I gave another example, which was this example from the Mishnah here, which those who are in nod their heads and those who are out say, "Oh, come on, you got to be kidding me! I don't see 4 birds here, 2 olos and 3 olos and a chatas, etc." You thought I'm making it up, but we're not making it up. We've come to a convention, we've agreed. So I just want to show you, let's play this a couple more ideas. I want to just have some more examples to work with, so that it'll become sort of intuitive. I want you to understand these are not very limited examples. Chazal will end up coming up with a lexicon that's full of thousands of these kinds of linguistic symbols that they're referring to their metaphorical language, which they see perfectly sensible, but to the outsider it looks nonsensical. So I'll give another example here. I like this. I don't Jim. This is writing. Let's try it. Does anyone see in this a delicious loaf of bread?
See what?
Put your hand up. If you look at this, you see a delicious loaf of bread. So 2 people see loaves of bread, and the rest are like, what? You out of your minds? Are you joking? Right. If you're looking at it, right, you understand? No, so that's so Chazal speak a different language. So if you actually read something which means something totally different. If you don't, that's what. Remember, if he said some things you'll misinterpret, and other people's will be, and it will just become nonsense. So these are the nonsense interpretations. But this is something which seems to make perfect sense to you, but you're totally misinterpreting it if the intention is to talk about a French word. Again, it's just this is a metaphor about metaphors. Which is a little strange, right? But to give you an idea, maybe a couple more. No one feels excluded. Who sees? What about this? You look at this. Does anybody see a very exciting nail-biting tennis match going on over here?
Right.
And the rest are like, what are you talking about tennis? They're not doing tennis whatsoever, you understand? Right. But from the inside, you understand? So that's how it's going to work. And if you know the language and you're expecting it, you know exactly what you're looking at. But if you don't, it's absolutely incomprehensible that this could be referring to tennis. What? There's a big gap.
Refers to what, sorry?
Tennis. The answer is so when you keep score tennis, you keep there's 5 sets in a 5-set game, and these are the games, the score. So you have to win by 2, so it's 6-4. This person won the first 2 and then lost in tiebreakers.
I think the last one can't be 7-6.
Okay, you're right. Okay,
Whatever.
You understand it too well. That's the trouble.
Okay, I'll do one more for those who wrote this. Does anybody, when I write this down, does anybody see a geometric figure?
No, it's a line.
Yeah. So some people look at it, see a line here. Some people say a line. Well, yeah, I mean line. But this is the standard equation to describe a line. Doesn't matter how it works. But anyway, the point is, so again, so all these things, the second you take one look at them, you know what you're looking at if you're on the inside. And it makes perfect sense. This is something very, very descriptive. These are all very descriptive things. Highly descriptive and highly specific. This is actually a general equation. Whatever. This is highly descriptive, right? These are all very highly descriptive, meaning high specificity. There's only one particular node, one particular molecule, one particular woman and her obligations. This is one particular line, one particular tennis match, one particular word. But to the outsider, it's like the language is totally lost upon them. And it's not just, my point is not just language, not just like French to English or some sort of particular symbolic system. It's that Chazal can develop in a whole world of symbols. They're linguistic symbols, not visual symbols. But when they say one thing, by analogy, like these things, they actually refer to something totally different. If the outsider says, this is just gobbledygook, these are meaningless nonsense, or totally other what they refer to, really Chazal means something specific. That's what he's getting at over here. Okay? So is this idea sort of sunk in? We'll see as we go more. And our code word for them will be our polar bears, right? The reasons we said yesterday. Okay, so now back inside, I want to finish the essay here. And then I'll take questions. No, I guess I'm going to take questions what we've said so far. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Okay, so the knowledge that Chazal hid away because they thought it was impossibly dangerous, that's what you call sod? Kabbalah?
Not necessarily. Okay, that's a good question. There's a general. Okay, so I'm sorry, I did say one other thing at length yesterday, which I didn't review today. Good point. I said that the Kabbalistic Svarim, they have a hierarchy set up of how the Torah has been encoded up to 4 different levels. These levels parallel the 4 levels of Olamos of universes, and 4 levels of your soul, and all sorts of 4 levels of Hashem's name, and all sorts of 4 levels of things, the 4 letters of Hashem's name. So they have Pshat, which is something's physical manifestation, simple understanding, then Remez, which are like hints, then Drashos, which are, I don't know, take the decoder ring the specific way when the Torah is decoded. It's not compelling logic, but there's a built-in decoding system. And finally, Sod, which is the deepest of them. And I said that Sod means secret, literally, and I said that it's secretive. When something's a secret, I said usually that's something extrinsic. In other words, the fact is the fact. It's only a secret because I happen to have not told it to you yet. But it's only a secret for those who don't know. It's not a secret for those who do know. If that's true, that means that this particular fact isn't intrinsically a secret. It just happens to be it's being withheld from you. So that's not what Chazal would mean. What they mean when they say sod is that there's a certain body of information about, it's something like, I don't have a better metaphor than this, to be honest. So if those are unfamiliar, it's not going to help very much. But it's something, let's say, like physics. Okay, the physics of the spiritual world. So if you have any experience with physics beyond just basic kinetics, like things banging into each other, so right away you realize you're talking about things like waves or fields or small particles that there's no real analog in real life for them. And you start talking about symbolically and mathematically about them, but they're not that. They're not numbers, and they're not symbols, and they're not waves like on the beach, or particles like billiard balls. There's something else. But since we don't know how to describe it in any reasonable way, we have nothing really on planet Earth that we're familiar with in our everyday experience, we speak totally metaphorically about these phenomena, which are very real and actually govern the way the world works, but they're totally, to talk about them in any meaningful way, you can talk purely symbolically about them, which end up, the more advanced physics becomes, the more symbolic it all becomes, just mathematical it becomes. It doesn't make it any less real, it just becomes more and more difficult to use a word to describe it. Or we speak in general terms, purely in metaphor, useful expressions like waves and particles and fields. And there's nothing really, I don't really think about a field besides a football pitch, right? A baseball field. But like a magnetic field has nothing to do with that. But there's nothing else like a magnetic field in our experience. We have to have some word. I don't know if that resonates with you or not. But by the same token, and it's not just, I don't think it's just a happenstance analogy. I think it's very much, the universe is analogous in this way. That there's an underlying reality of a spiritual world, and he actually will mention that in a little bit in the essay here, which we'll call Kabbalah, like the Kabbalistic mechanics of the universe, what goes on behind the scenes upstairs. So those are purely they're real, but they're abstract. In other words, the same way, you know, a photon or a graviton or a nucleon or a neutrino or whatever you want to talk about are real. But to talk about what a neutrino is, you're just wasting your time. You just start putting symbols on a board. You just write a symbol for a neutrino, you know that is, or whatever. These things don't behave in a normal way. Or electrons. Electrons are probably at least a familiar word for everyone here. Electrons are not like anything you've ever encountered, but we'll talk about them in one or the other in a way that's at least useful to talk about, although it's not really true. But if you want to talk about how electrons behave, it just becomes purely mathematical and symbolic. The description of what they do and how they work becomes just pure symbolic mathematics, right? The same is true, and they defy language. There's no real words, useful words to describe these things and how they work, because, as I said yesterday, language becomes some sort of like common agreement on what things are. You've seen the same thing as me, so we say, oh, that's a fly, because we both called it a fly. Or that's bread, or if we speak English, or pawn if we speak French. We come to some agreement on what to call this thing. If you've never seen a phase shift in an atom, and you never will, there's nothing to see, right? So then, there's never a word we can have a common experience about. We'll just have to describe these things mathematically, and there's no words for them. So by analogy, I think by very good analogy, the sod of the Torah, we're talking about the mechanics of the spiritual world. We're talking about things like malachim, which if you want to call angels, you call angels. When I say angel, I don't know what you think. You think of fat kids with wings. I know that's what you think of. And there's certainly no fat kids with wings floating around up there, or between here and Hashem, or whatever up there is. Of course not. But malachim come in different varieties. The Rambam lists 10 of them. Let's go with him. He's certainly not a Kabbalist. But in any case, they come in different varieties, and they do specific things. They work, and there's a language of them. But to describe what they do, whatever words we say are going to be misleading. And even if you say wings, as the Navi do describe angels having wings, malachims having wings, he didn't mean it literally, because they're non-physical things. The non-physical things don't have wings. So it has to be what wings refer to, the same way as electrons aren't really particles or waves, but they kind of act like waves that we're familiar with, and so on. So to answer your question now, the level of Torah called Sod is dealing with like the underlying pinnings of the mechanics of the spiritual world, spheros and intermediary forces and so on, and there's no real useful words for them, so you only can dance around the idea. Hence they're intrinsically so, they're be'etzim, they are intrinsically secret, not because no one will tell you, but because there's no way to tell you. But if you're familiar with the language enough, it starts to make sense, you get an intuition of it. Maybe not so unlike these things over here. In other words, let's take H2O. Like, once you know how it works, anyone who's familiar, and I think we're all mostly familiar with that, like we just see that, we know that's referring to a water molecule, right? But actually, how two hydrogens and an oxygen come together to create a water molecule is probably beyond all of us. I think maybe it's beyond everyone. Why it should be that way? Hydrogen is hydrogen, oxygen is oxygen, and how magically those things make the wet stuff out of the sink is pretty surprising, to say the least. So the same kind of thing. There's no words for it, but we can have some sort of symbolic language. So the language of Kabbalah is also rather symbolic in nature, or talking purely metaphorically. But you can't take it. We're not talking about H's and O's and 2's here, right? We're not H's and O's. We're talking about particular things, atoms floating around. So Sod, that level of Torah, is something that's non-verbal. It transcends language, and there's no way to articulate it in a language in a normal sense. Only speak about it metaphorically. So then, that's Sod in general. He's saying here that Chazal wanted to talk about different things. Some might be taka Sod, and some might be less, just might be even ethical, or just something less deep, but deep enough that they wanted to keep it to themselves. They wanted to keep it to themselves, meaning they didn't want to make it public knowledge for anybody, and therefore they spoke in this metaphorical language. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, so just to clarify one thing, so Kabbalah is not synonymous with Sod.
Let's say it is.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Kabbalah will be synonymous with Sod for our purposes. Yeah. These Aggadah aren't all Kabbalistic in nature. Even though I conflated Chachma Elokis and Kabbalah because I don't know exactly what. Chachma Elokis means like divine wisdom, But let's say, for example, if you ever opened a Sefer Derech Hashem, the Ramchal also wrote that. He was a Kabbalist. I certainly wouldn't call that Kabbalah in nature, right? It's not Kabbalistic. He's talking about the whys and whats and hows of the spiritual world and doing mitzvahs and the daily cycle and so on. That wouldn't be called Kabbalistic in nature, but it's certainly in the Chochmah Elokis, it's talking about how like the system works. So like, he doesn't mean just Kabbalistic in nature at all. Yeah.
The Aggadah is within the Gemorah text, or it's a separate?
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah. So the Gemorah text is something I've seen different assessments. It's within the Gemorah text. But the Gemorah, again, so the Talmud is two parts. There's a Mishnah and then there's Gemorah on the Mishnah. The Gemorah is something between, depending on who you ask and who counts, and it's actually quite hard to exactly define it, a 10th and a 6th Aggadah. So a lot, a big chunk, right? A big chunk, somewhere like between 10 and 16%, is non-halachic in nature. It's a lot, obviously. And it's mixed in. In Brachos, it's tons. I don't know if I told you guys when I introduced Brachos, maybe as fully as I could have. Brachos is the longest Masechta. It's very, very long. In words, by far the longest Masechta. There's a rumor going around, it's the same number of words as Bava Basra. Don't believe it. It's not true, as far as I know. But it's very, very, Brachos is very, very long. And much of it, I almost said most, I don't know if it's true most, but certainly much of it, a great deal of it, probably most of it, is Aggadic in nature. A huge chunk, much more than 10% of the 6. You'll see as we get on.
The heading for the explaining statements and focusing on specific verses, there was a heading. What was the heading? Lamed Aleph. I couldn't get to that. No, the other side, from the two branches from the God.
So he says in his opening paragraph there are ma'amarim limudim,
Right.
that are standalone educational, which are either Musar or Chochmah Elokis, divine wisdom, and then he also said biurim, explanations. Biurim, yeah. And I'm actually not going to read the half of the essay about biurim, because that's, if we be learning midrashim, or maybe when you're addressing a specific subject, like midrash, I'm sure you've learned midrash before. You heard, there's a midrash that says, and it starts taking a pasuk and says what it really means, and it starts doing something very complicated. So that's midrash, and it's a biur, it's an explanation of the meaning of a verse, or deep meaning of a verse, or secondary intention of a verse, which I'm not talking about at the moment, because for the most part, like the vast majority of the Aggadah we're going to encounter is going to be the first variety, just statements standing alone, not addressing a particular pasuk.
The biur coming from?
Explain.
So it's not the same word for well?
Well, it actually is related to the word well, the air, but biur means to explain in general. But meaning, I guess that it would be because it's bringing out the depth of what's going on over there. Hence the well connection. Yeah, but the air is to explain in general. Good? Okay, so I want to finish up this essay here, at least this last paragraph. So in the Hebrew one, we left off on the first page, the second column, where it says Derech Gimel, the second paragraph there. Can someone know where we are in the English version? I can just shout it out. The third.
On page 206,
Do you see here?
Like 207.
the second paragraph down, it says what the third method is.
Okay, yeah, so that must be yeah. So page 206 where it says the third method. So here, let's unread this. I sort of let the cat out of the bag, saying the third method is going to be what I said, speaking sort of in trivialities. Here's what he says aside. I have to say that whoever put the periods and the paragraphs in this Hebrew version, I don't know what they were thinking. It doesn't make any sense at all to me. Or I don't know what I'm thinking. One of us do not understand this essay at all. It's not broken up sensibly in any case. So I don't know why, like all of a sudden, the third wave got its own paragraph. Why that? I don't know. But in this paragraph, there's a separate idea I want to bring up also. So in any case, it says, Haderech HaShlishi, the third way that they concealed their Chochmah Elokis, their wisdom they wanted to hide away, was Hu HaKalut. Kalus is, in trivialities, I'll translate as. V'hu she'eze ikar gadol v'nechbad. There's some certain heavy-duty principle that's got gravitas, it's like significant and important. So, but Yermzuhu b'devarim nirim l'chora kalim u'bilti ikrim. They alluded to them, these deep matters, with things that seem ostensibly to be, trivial and without much substance. Commercially, I had yotim, like the, secular fable tellers, like Aesop's fables type stuff, Grimm, Anderson, and so on. Vehem mechavnim bazeh al yanim nechbadim v'ramim. The truth is that Chazal, when they say these stories, they actually have intention to refer to something that's weighty and lofty. Hashem devarim hakalim lahem hem ha'ara lahem. These trivial statements are there just to sort of like a tip off, allude to reference these things. Eitzel mishi odea u'makir b'mizus ha'ila. That it'll be a tip off to someone who knows how to read these, these kind of simple stories, is what they're really referring to. Like, again, example which we're all quite familiar with is oftentimes they'll say, once upon a time there was a king and a princess. You know when that starts, any rabbinic story, the king is Hashem, princess usually is your neshama being sent down. There's a code word, and right away everyone knows, we're not talking about kings and princesses. So that's what he's talking about, that kind of stuff. So that guy, he knows how to deal with these matters in his mind. He knows how to translate and compare and equate. He knows how the translation of what these things are really referring to. They reveal things, what they're really hidden matter they're talking about. Simple, lowly matters to really elevated matters. He knows those are the guys who have access to it. There are mashal, like for example, there's a statement when Chazal say, Yankusa Klila the Durdi. Youth is like a wreath of roses. Sibusa Klila the Chilfi, and old age is like a wreath of thorns. So they're not talking about wreaths of anything. It's almost something all together. And similarly, Adaloa Vidna Bachishna. That's like more in Shabbos, maybe those who learn Shabbos. I've seen it not so long ago. Literally means, even though I didn't lose anything, I'm really bent over looking for it, something like that. Varabma Okela, things like that. Because I'll have sort of these epithets that seem to be talking about silly things, but really no, they're talking about something very, very heavy. Fine. Now, period. I put a new paragraph over here. That's the third point. Now I'm saying a whole new point. The Ramchal is saying a whole new point. I don't know why it's smushed in here, but this is the last point I want to bring out. It's a very important point. He says, Od Sarach Shatida. Also, you should know, a new thing, a heavy duty thought here. Shedevar Ram Ikri Sodos Yiramzum, Chazal Binyana Min HaTeva or Tichonos. Lots of times they will speak, Chazal in the Gemorah, or in general, Chazal will speak about things in terms, allusions will be in terms of nature, in terms of science, or astronomy, astronomical phenomena, or natural phenomena. V'yishtamshu min halimudim shahayu melamdim bedor sahem. And they'll speak in terms of the science and the scientific phenomena and understanding of their day, of the days of the Amoraim, or whoever wrote the particular Aggadah. Anshe chachma hativos tevos vatchuna. Based on the science of those who knew science and astronomy of their day. Amnam, you should know, but amnam, ein ha'ikr lehem ha'inyan hahu ha'tivi o ha'tichoni. The truth is that the statements, when Chazal say some statements about nature or about astronomy, they don't actually really are not all that interested in talking about astronomy or nature. Ela hasod shiratzu lirmozba. They only really want to talk about something they're alluding to. They're actually, in other words, Chazal, the Gemorah didn't come to teach you astronomy or teach you science. That's not their interest here. The interest of the Gemorah is to teach the Torah Shabbal Peh and the explanation thereof. And when Chazal talk about scientific phenomena, while they may be true, as you'll say in a second, but that's not their point at all. They're not interested in that per se. You want to know science? Go read a science book. You want to know Chachma Elokis? So read the Talmud. And when the Chazal talk about scientific phenomena, they don't really care about scientific phenomena. That's not their interest. And therefore, lo Yosef lo Yigra. It makes no darn difference. It doesn't help or detract. Al amita sa'inyan hanirmaz amhayos halavush mashleahu. It doesn't really make a darn difference if the particular scientific phenomenon they're talking about actually is true or not true, says the Ramchal. It doesn't matter, because that's not the point at all. Asher hilbishuhu amiti olo. Sorry. Yes, yeah, no, not. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. In other words, because they don't care about the science. They had it in their days. Science perceived this is the way something worked. They said that's a great must for how something in the metaphysical world works, and therefore they talked in those terms. If it turns out in the 21st century you discover that that's not how the world works, after all, that doesn't change anything. If you want to understand what Chazal mean, first of all, they didn't mean scientific information. They're not interested in writing science. That's for a science textbook, not for a Talmud. But you also won't be able to understand what they mean unless you think about the scientific phenomenon in the way that they're talking about it. Right? Because they're talking about, I, a moment ago, talked about these things, or about electrons, or about accounting, or about polar bears. That's because that's things that we're sort of familiar with. They weren't familiar with polar bears, they wouldn't talk about polar bears, or accounting, or electrons. They use other things to talk about it. The whole point was to hide, dress up the secret. They wanted to talk in a language that was familiar, use words, metaphorical language that was familiar to them in their time. But the same point that they wanted to say could have just easily been, in garb and wrapped and concealed in any other clothing. If they had a different mashal, they would have grabbed on it. If they were living in a different generation. So, if so to speak, if I were more writing, a Gemorah today, I might be talking about polar bears and electrons because that's stuff that we could talk about. They talked about other things because that's the world they lived in. They talked about oxen because they knew about oxen. I'm not familiar with oxen. When the Chazal are talking about Mishalom about, a bull in the springtime, that means nothing to me because I don't know how bulls behave in the springtime or how they perceive bulls to behave in the springtime in their time. But that's what he's saying. Get that important point. That the Talmud is not a scientific text or astronomical text, and that didn't really interest them. They needed a language, a metaphor, and that was the language of the science of their time was a useful language to work with, and therefore they used it. But don't get bogged down. It doesn't make it irrelevant if it's true or not true. What is relevant is understanding what they mean, the analogy they're talking about. That's just what the guy who made the particular statement used. That's because he happened to live when he lived. Okay, fine. Period. Now, last point that I want to bring out from this essay here is, when it comes to scientific phenomena, even though what they're talking about may or not be our understanding of how the world works today, and that doesn't matter, that's their interest, nevertheless, you should understand, you need to understand, that Chazal have a particular framework, the Torah's framework, of understanding the relationship between the scientific world down here, the natural world, and what goes on down here, and how things work in the spiritual realm. There's some sort of, it's like nested, it's like intertwined, interconnected in such a way that what goes on down here is a reflection of what goes on up there. Hence, when I was referring a moment ago when I said, I don't think when I said a metaphor for Kabbalistic stuff is physics, and I said I don't think it's just a useful metaphor. I don't think it's coincidence. I think the way the world is set up, as he will talk about in a second, is there's some sort of rule-based system which governs the underpinnings of the physical world, just like there's a rule-based system that governs the underpinnings of the spiritual world. So he's going to say here, look at this last point here, and with all these scientific, natural, astronomical observations or statements, you have to know, the worldview of Chazal, it works in the assumption that the physical world, misnagim umitpalim, the conduct of the physical world and the events of the physical world are governed by or connected to mekochos ruchniim levinehem. They're hooked up and impacted by some sort of spiritual forces, each appropriate to it. Dahainu, hamalachim, hashedim, mazikim, different spiritual phenomena, which the Ramchal and the Hashem, for example, talks about how there's intermediary things between, between Hashem way up there, so to speak, and this world of action where we are our body's a piece of meat way down here. There's like a neshama and different stages that link up. There's also different kinds of spiritual forces that convey Hashem's will and the soul's nourishment and the impact of mitzvahs and averas. They're these conduits and force that move things up and down, and they are interconnected. And what happens down here is directly a reflection of something that went on above. And the same goes in reverse, by the way, it says. all down here, what goes on like the low world, misnoim mehashpa'at halyonim. The events of the lower world are direct consequences of influences from the upper world. V'chen divrei hagashmim osim roshim beruchanim. You should know that also that events that happen down here impacts the spiritual world as well. It's like a two-way cycle. Umishlo yakir haderech hazeh. If you don't understand this way of looking at the world, that Chazal understand that they're interconnected, and therefore, when they talk about a physical phenomenon, they could be talking about it also being true, but it also teaches you something about how things work upstairs, and vice versa. Because it's not a coincidence; it's not just a useful metaphor. There's a reason why dogs do what dogs do, and cows do what cows do, and donkeys do what donkeys do, and that's telling you something about these things. They're actually connected. So if you don't understand that Chazal look at them as being interconnected, he will never be able to la'amod al da'atam klal v'ikar. If you don't understand there's this assumption that there's an interconnectivity between the Gashmi physical world and the spiritual world, you won't get any of these Chazals, because they understand that they're not just coincidental, they're interconnected. Okay, fine, period. I think that's the last point is quite abstract. Let me at least give my own metaphor. It's not his metaphor, it's my metaphor. Take it or leave it. There's something like this going on. Speaking metaphor, and yes, the whole point of these 2 days is to get used to the fact you can speak in metaphor, and what you're saying is true, but not literally true. Okay? So there's something like this. That's a metaphor, right? Like, it's a simile, I guess, of how this works. There's Hashem and His will up there somewhere. You could think of it, for argument's sake, a havdil is like, as ruts and will is like your brain has a will. Okay? And then there's like a world outside, totally separate from your mind, like say your fingers, this physical world, okay? So there's a connection. There's this complex system that connects the will expressed by my brain and my fingers out here, okay? And that translates through a number of stages. There's a brain. I don't know how the mind works. I don't think anyone really does know how the mind works really, and how it connects to the brain. That's a great philosophical and neurophysical conundrum. But however it works, somehow there's a will that occurs in the brain. Maybe it's from Hashem, whatever it is. And the will says, fingers should wiggle. So what happens is, the first thing happens is some fancy electron transfer going on between the synapses in the brain. And that makes a chemical cascade, which then tells to the brain to send some messages down to the brainstem, and then down to the spinal cord, which then actually passes those translation of that chemical, chain of events, then signals electrical impulses from the top of your brainstem through your spinal column and through your nervous system to get to the fingers. And on the far side, those electrical impulses then stimulate nerve fibers and muscle fibers, which make the fingers and the muscles contract and your fingers wiggle. So there's a lot of things happening between when the brain says fingers wiggle and the fingers doing the wiggling, right? And they're like on different levels. Some are electrical, some are chemical, some are physical. And they go, at least in my metaphor here, and how they work over there also, from something very, very abstract, like will, which is, whatever the heck will is super duper abstract, to like, electrons passing over synapses, and then, chemical cascades and electrical phenomena, and then physical twitching. There's like different stages of the chain down from the wiggling up in the will center to the wiggling down in the physical center. Okay, so something like that is happening in the spiritual world also. That Hashem has a will, and then He, so to speak, like this. We're speaking the same way that the mind is sort of undifferentiated, sort of like one and sort of part, there's no pieces to the mind. Hashem's will is like that in some way, let's say. But then it can have specific messages sent out. It can send one particular impulse to wiggle this finger and one particular impulse to wiggle this foot, and so on. Lots of things can happen simultaneously. There's hearts beating, there's lungs pumping, there's digestion happening. Right? There's a world of activity being governed by this center of will, each with its own little conduit governing it. And some is sympathetic, and some is parasympathetic, and some is by intentional, unintentional, and so on and so forth. So that's what's happened. There's this fancy thing, Hashem up there, or not fancy, whatever it is. There's Hashem, the source of will, and then there's a whole world of, let's call it wirings, spiritual wiring, which is not so different than chemical, electrical wiring in us, that hooks up some sort of physical phenomenon out here. And it's not apparent at all how the fingers and the mind, will are connected, but we know there actually is beneath the surface, hidden away, there actually is some complex wiring. Some of it is physical, some of it is electrical, some of it is chemical, and so on. Something like that's happening also. That there's this, Hashem has a will, and when he sends out a malach to do his will, it's kind of like, by analogy, like the brain sending out an electrical impulse down, down the nervous system. And there's a particular impulse that has a particular instruction, it's got a particular address to wiggle a particular, muscle fiber, and so on. So there's a direct connection, of course, between the brain and the muscle fiber, but it's intermediaries. That's what he's talking about over here. That there's some sort of, this is the system that we imagine imagining it's not true, but we impute this complex system of will translating to wiggling up there in the spiritual realms, which then chain down to other kinds of wiggles and strings pulled until phenomena happen down here. I'm sure you're very well aware of the famous Chazal. It says, like a blade of grass doesn't move without an angel standing over it and smacking it saying, go, go. That's what it's referring to. That everything is being governed. We believe, like the real belief, is that really Ein Levado is nothing but Hashem, and nothing at all happens except for Hashem's direct controlling and will and its expression, exactly what Hashem wants. Nothing. It's all Hashem. We create the world every second, and Hashem is a very incredibly complex psychological veil put over us that we are convinced that our decisions have direct impact on what goes on out here. But actually there's no connection whatsoever, direct connection whatsoever. What you choose to do and the consequences of your actions are totally disconnected. There's absolutely no connection whatsoever. Zero. Zip, zilch. Hashem does whatever the heck he feels like doing, and then, based on whatever calculations he wants to make, it's just that. Hashem has a big plan. He has to get us to Mashiach by the end. He's got a zillion ways to do it. And since he wants you to have free will, and you do have free will. You do have total free will. Your choices are yours. Just whether you succeed. The outcome of your choice is not up to you. That's Hashem's doing. But most of the time Hashem figures, the best thing I can do is let whatever the guy wanted to have happen, so he feels he's in control. And I'll make it work. I'll make it work another way. I think I told you in my Mishnah show before, this is a true story that happened. I'm digressing from a point, but this is such an important topic point, I want to make it anyways. When I was a kid, gone for secondary school, in the 8th grade, so this grand master chess woman came to the school. And there was a bunch of chess boards set around in the courtyard, and whoever wanted to play chess there could play with her. And that's what happened. She basically walks in a circle. You've seen this stunt, right? That she basically keeps it going in circles and plays everyone. And of course, 15 minutes later, everyone's lost. But anyway, so that's how the game went, of course. But the winner of the students, was the one who lasted the most rounds with her, and that kid got to play like a real mechubad way. It's obviously not very mechubad to get played like that, right? So this is how the game began. That the kid sits on one side of the table, and there's Grand Mistress on the other side of the table, and the game begins like this. The woman says, okay, pick a number between 10 and 20. And he says, 14, whatever he said, I don't remember. She says, fine, I'm now going to checkmate you in 14 moves. And that's what happened. Of course, on the 14th move was checkmate. So that's an amazing, amazing, amazing mashal. Because that's how Hashem works, right? In other words, or it's a mashal. But the kid, he has total free will. I'm sure he got to be white, and he got to do whatever you want. You do whatever you want. It doesn't matter, because you can do whatever you want, and I'll let you get your way. And still, I'm so much way ahead of you and so in control of this macro system that whatever you do doesn't make a difference, because I can still engineer things to get to exactly how they need to come to. And that's what happens. So that's the way the world works. 99.9% of the time, people have a will, and when they pull the trigger, the gun fires, because why should Hashem make miracles and the gun's not firing? But don't worry. If he needs it not to fire, he'll make it not fire, or you'll have an aneurysm right then, or you'll forget what you're doing, or any of the million things the miracles that happen every day, which are just, can always be ascribed to coincidence or malfunction or just happen. That happens, but most of the time the world runs in accordance with people's will, because that's how Hashem can keep things under wraps. Anyways, that was a digression from our main point. But the main point I want to bring out here is Chazal, this framework, that there's a Hashem up there, and he's calling all the shots, every last shot, through the system of intermediaries, these intermediary forces. It's called angels, malachim. And there's a special kind of malach he uses Levinehem. There's a polar bear malach. You know what I mean? Don't misunderstand me. There's a every blade of grass has a grass malach, and every donkey has a donkey malach, and every finger has I don't know a finger, but every rock has a rock malach, perhaps. It's appropriate kind of governing thing, just so to speak, the same way like every finger has its own, nerves feeding into it, and there's a different nerve for each one. Some fingers are more sensitive, and so on and so forth. Each one's appropriate to each finger and each toe and each part of your body. So Chazal understands there's a hookup here, and there's a specific kind of, not only is there a unique kind of intermediary that connects Hashem to each of the physical phenomena, but there's a purposeful parallelism between how these spiritual phenomena work and the physical phenomena work, and therefore when the Chazal talk about whatever they're talking about, ducks, for argument's sake, and they're observing how ducks walk, and they say, the duck walks like such, that's how women are, whatever. So, Hashem put ducks in the world for a reason, to teach that lesson, so to speak, but even if ducks wouldn't walk that way, it wouldn't matter, but the point is there's a specific way ducks walk for a specific reason, and that can be a useful metaphor for them to say how women walk too, for argument's sake. So, okay, we'll stop over there, and tomorrow, as Hashem, I'll take questions if nothing is settled, and then we'll move on back to the Gemorah document, as Hashem.
That's when we owe a sign.